Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, and I've been thinking that if you go through life with a song in your heart, then you aren't absolutely guaranteed of a happy ending. But if you go through life making sure there's a heart in your song, and that heart happens to be Larry Hart, then you are pretty much assured success. And interestingly, of course, the song With a Song in Your Heart is also by Larry Hart and his long-term collaborator Richard Rodgers. And so it's entirely appropriate that today, and indeed next week here on Musical Talk, we're going to be looking again in depth at one of the best Rodgers and Hart musical shows, and that is the Boys From Syracuse from 1938, getting a very welcome revival here in London at an off-West End venue, that's upstairs at the Gatehouse, from the 5th to the 29th of September 2024. So at the time that this episode is broadcast, that is about to open on the 5th of September. And I'll be telling you more details at the end of the programme, how you can see that production of The Boys From Syracuse. But I do hope that this week's episode and next week's episode will act as a bit of an appetite whetter for that production. Now, if you remember last week, I was talking to the director of that show, that's Mark Geisser, and we had a wonderful conversation about his approach to staging this classic 1938 Rodgers and Hart musical comedy. A great book by George Abbott, and of course an absolutely sparkling score, with, in my opinion, not a single bad song. And how rare, of course, is that? But this week and next week, I'll be talking to Benjamin Levy. Now, Benjamin Levy is the musical director and indeed the orchestrator of this production of The Boys From Syracuse. And it's fascinating to talk about this show in depth with someone who really understands the show from the inside out. And that's exactly what Benjamin brings to the table. And I'm so excited to be bringing his voice to you because this week we're going to be talking about what it is that a musical director actually does and also what it is an orchestrator does. And Benjamin does both. And it's a lot more than you might think. But on top of that, Benjamin and I had a wonderful in-depth conversation about the show in its theatrical 360-degree version, but also about the wonderful score by Richard Rodgers and Larry Hart. This week we are concentrating more on the role of the musical director and the orchestrator, and what it is to bring a show from the 1930s back to life in the 21st century, and next week we'll be concentrating more on the score of this fabulous show. But, of course, conversations bleed back and forth, so this week there's plenty still to talk about in terms of analysing the songs. And now that's quite enough from me. I'm excited about The Boys From Syracuse, and I hope that you will be too. And I'm sure you'll also enjoy this fabulous conversation with the incredibly talented, award-winning Benjamin Levy. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
Hello, my name is Benjamin Levy, and I am currently serving as the musical director officially and orchestrator for the off-West End revival of The Boys From Syracuse.
Now, you've immediately said something that's piqued my interest. You said musical director and orchestrator.
Quite
now,
so.
I would often associate one with the other, and I know there's an enormous overlap, but you made the distinction. I suppose, may I ask you why?
Well, depending on the scale and how commercial or otherwise the show is, the role of the musical director now is very flexible. It used to be that the musical director directs the music and is responsible for all things music. These days now, though, we've got musical supervisors and the music team has expanded as the shows have expanded. Typically, I think, the role of the musical director would normally involve, the old cliche is teaching the show, maintaining the show and conducting the show. So you're given a score, you teach those singing parts to the cast, noting them to make sure everything's together, to make sure the harmonies are correct, to make sure it's all clear. You then rehearse the band, make sure the band's playing as one unit, and then conduct the show, often playing the piano as well as conducting. The old head bob going along where, where your hands aren't free. For this show, though, I also doubled up to the orchestrator, which you may know means I'll receive a piano vocal score and will then be responsible for realising that for orchestra. Of course, the show itself was realised initially for a very large orchestra.
A good Broadway orchestra in 1938.
In 1938.
So, when there was a few bob to be had.
Very much so, very much so. Well, the way they normally style these things is the orchestral sound was rather large. But what intrigued me when I first saw the score was, for the most part, the ensemble work, the vocal ensemble work, was for the most part in unison. So the textures seemed to be very, very thick orchestral textures. And everyone's singing the same notes, no vocal harmonies. Now, I don't have the luxury of that. It might be surprising to learn. I've got a lineup of 5, and only 5. And the instruments I chose initially seemed like an odd choice. I've gone for keyboard, and typically the theatre trend these days is to program that keyboard.
Yes, to do everything.
But I've not done that. My keyboard will be set on a piano patch the entire time.
Excellent. So it is essentially a piano.
It effectively acts as a piano. The only reason why we're going for an electric rather than acoustic is for the most part, it helps tuning, but it means we can balance it and disperse the sound properly throughout the space. But I've gone with trombone, reed, which is flute, doubling clarinet and alto sax, double bass, certainly not electric bass, and drums percussion. We're using a fancy, what we call mallet station now. It's an electric, it looks to the outsider like an electric xylophone. And I've really made a feature of this. And he'll be doubling glockenspiel, xylophone. I don't know what it is about the presence of live percussion that just makes everything sound huge.
Well, I tell you, it's interesting, but some of those elements, the double bass and the drums sounds very jazzy.
Yes.
And of course, 1938 is also a very jazzy period, and I've seen this show described as a swing score.
Yes.
So it feels like it's at home, but I suppose if you don't mind me then asking, why did you pick those instruments? If the decision is yours and you're orchestrating it, you've got all the instruments in the world, in theory. Mm-hmm. I appreciate you've only got X number of people to play them, and it depends on what they can do. Mm-hmm. But, it sounds really eclectic.
I've really thought about texture.
Yeah.
I have 5.
And can I say texture is very much a thematic thing. You've mentioned it once before already. You were talking about the thick texture of the original 1938 sound.
Quite so. So, there's quite a lot. And actually, I agree with the assertion that it's quite a swing, jazz-heavy score. You hear that in songs like Oh Diogenes, where it's full-on swing band, really.
And This Can't Be Love.
This Can't Be Love, definitely so. It has elements of what you might think of as classic pre-Golden Age musical theatre. There are definitely elements of classical. The opening is nothing short of Gilbert and Sullivan. It's I Have Twins. It's absolute nonsense. And the call and response between soloist and ensemble, it's very dramatic lyric writing. It's a pastiche, I think, of Gilbert and Sullivan before them.
And I'll be wanting to talk to you about that, if I may. I'm told, now I can't remember who it was, but somebody referred to Rodgers and Hart as Gilbert and Sullivan during the 1938 production.
Gosh.
Slightly disparagingly, apparently, although that's a matter of choice and taste, I think. But it's really interesting you should say that. That first song, I think, is unlike anything else in the piece.
Yes, I agree.
And I'd love to come back and analyse it with you if that's okay. But we're still on, how did you pick your eclectic choice of instruments? And it's clear that you would, forgive me, I interrupted you when you were talking about texture.
Yes. So I think really, whenever when we're presented with a massive soundtrack and a piano vocal score, which was clearly written for a large orchestra, straight away you lose volume. But what you lose in volume, you gain in clarity. We've got a cast of 8, and essentially the band and the cast are operating as solo voice ensembles. So what I've basically done is what I lose in thick harmony with the lack of players, I've made up for by taking the cast out of a unison sound and into 8-part harmony. So for a lot of the show, all 8 are singing their own part, which really adds clarity to each part, I find. One thing I said to the cast in rehearsals at one point was, if one person runs down the street screaming something, you'll get it first time. But if a whole mob of people run down the street screaming the same thing, you won't. Because what you gain in volume, you lack in clarity. So with that in mind, what's taken some people by surprise is I chose reed, trombone, double bass, and piano. Well, piano, bass, and acoustic bass particularly, and drums make sense. That's a standard jazz trio, and that's the combo sound. I've now got 2 bells and whistles instruments, so to speak. And I've done that by making the poor drummer, he's got hard work to do, because he'll be supporting the rhythm section on kit. It's a very heavy percussion part. Lots of bells and whistles with triangles and xylophones and just expanding everything. But the really odd choice, and it took me a long time to settle on this, was the trombone.
Yes.
Solo trombone. The reason I've done that is it has a dual function. Every instrument in the band has a different function. The piano is the cha to the bass's Something's ultimately got to keep beyond beat 2 and 4. But the reason I chose trombone is because it's amazing for inner lines. So anything that would originally have been written as a cello line, the trombone takes very nicely. But I can also have...
Also got a similar movement, actually. You just did the mime, oddly, and I just...
Very much so.
I can see exactly what you're talking about, almost through your own physicality.
Oh, yes.
How interesting.
And actually, the people often think, also, someone said to me at one point, so you've got double bass and you've got trombone, very bass heavy. Not so. The trombone is a tenor instrument.
And people don't think that, do they?
They never do think of that. And I'm bless my poor trombonist. I've written a lot of it right at the top of the trombone's register, because it can double up as with a lovely rhythmic interplay between the alto sax and the trombone. So for brassier sections, I can have some interplay there. Whilst in other moments, it does function as that through line, providing stability to the overall shape. So I think that the trombone's a beautifully versatile instrument. And I don't know what it is about trombone solos that just screams jazz.
Yeah.
There's a lot of comedy.
Or Jack Teagarden, I think, is the first person who comes to me in my mind.
And actually, even with comic moments, trombone slides are a godsend. There's nothing quite like a trombone slide.
If you can add a mute, then you've hit the jackpot.
Oh yes, and I frequently do. I think I've written for whether I actually continue with this till the end of the tech period.
But as we speak, yes.
But I have Harmon mutes and straight mutes in. So I really have enjoyed exploring the trombone.
Now, what are they? Because you're now in a world beyond my understanding. A Harmon mute.
Harmon mute and a straight mute. I mean, a mute in simple terms is something you shove up the bell of the trombone, which closes the bell at the very top of the instrument. And because we're blocking the bell, it creates a slightly different sound. A Harmon mute versus a straight mute, they both do the same job, but because the shape differs slightly, it creates a slightly different sound. Yeah.
It really is. You can sort of almost tune the muting, or at least influence it and qualify it.
Yes. I favour a straight mute. It creates a classic wah sound as well.
I think of it as a wah wah.
Oh yeah. And there is actually a mute called a wah wah mute.
Is it really?
Or a cup mute. But it's I think I've tried to go for is a very vibrant, dynamic, but very, very clear sound. So I think I've picked all those instruments. I think they play nicely in the playground together. It's not random in any way, but I really did pore over how to choose those instruments. I mean, at one point, I nearly had a lineup that involved 2 keyboards. I needed a lineup which had, at one point I was going to use trumpet, reed, but I settled for trombone because it required something in the middle. I had bass, and the piano is good as a bass instrument. Just needed something to fill up those mid harmonics, and the trombone, I'm very happy with how it's
with its versatility in particular, as you say, and yeah, for straight and comic and high and low. Everything you say is really fascinating, actually, and quite eye-opening for me, possibly ear-opening. Can I ask though? You know, you've after quite a lot of soul searching, by the sound of it, you came upon your combination. Mm-hmm. Has there been a point as the show has developed in collaboration that you thought, I wish I'd gone for X, or no, this, you've been vindicated, this is exactly what I want, and actually it's paying off in spades? There
was one moment, actually, it was Ode Diogenes.
Yes.
Where it's very much a big band swing sound.
Yeah.
And actually, in the early days, I decided very early on not to even try to reduce. One thing to talk about now is orchestral reductions.
Oh, yes.
So we hear the big full soundtrack with enormous orchestra, and I'm going to try and reduce that for a 5-piece orchestra and try to recreate that sound with 5 players. That is a terrible idea.
You can't do it.
You can't do it.
Not well, anyway.
Absolutely you can't do it. And really, what you're doing there is writing and apologising for what you don't have. Whereas what you really should do is, that's one thing we were all taught when we train, is reorchestrate, don't reduce.
So own it, really.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
So I have a 5-piece band. It's a different lineup, but what new, how can I realise that in a new way? And actually, I've got the one thing I've been doing in the rehearsal process actually is bouncing tracks because I don't want the choreographer and the cast to get used to working with these large soundtracks. So what I've been doing is producing tracks with my orchestration so that in the room they have a sense of where the interest is. And it's been really, really, really interesting for Jared because he'll find that in my orchestration, Jared Hageman is our choreographer, and a wonderful choreographer he is too. He's been incredible actually at being sensitive to the singers, because of course the vocal load on the individual performer now is quite high.
Indeed, yeah, and the lyrics are really important in a Rodgers and Hart song, and there are so many witty lyrics and meaningful lyrics or sincere lyrics, but actually the lyrics do so much work in this. It's actually going to be a similar question for you on the music, but yeah, you were talking about the choreography and how it's got to serve the performance, isn't it?
I mean, really, the lyrics are wonderful. Lorenz Hart's is an utter genius. But really, the lyric tells you what's going on or what the story is. But the music and the choreography really tells you how to receive it. And that's why the integration between the music and the choreography had to be there. I mean, we had some hilarious moments of, I've put a triangle here, and Jared will then match that with a ludicrous camp move and we really have been that detailed with it. Even the way in which the singers are articulating the text, will reflect the underlying intention behind the text. We really have tried to honour that. It's only when you're rehearsing the songs in detail that you really get taken by individual lyrics. One that struck me today was, at one point, Luce refers to her husband Dromio as a cold potato.
Indeed, I took the tree of life one day and got a cold potato.
Got a cold potato. And the very next lyric is, I'm in a stew with the man. Yeah. And that is a wonderful, clearly intended pun. I'd never really noticed that before. I thought, I mean, there isn't a link between the thoughts, but yeah, he really has done cold potato stew.
Yeah,
so
funny enough,
clever.
I'm so glad you picked that up, because that's been, it's also within the constraint of the payoff to each rhyming couplet. Throughout the whole song is a new rhyme with the ooh rhyme. That's what you do with a man. That's nothing new with a man.
Yes.
Home is a zoo with a man. I'm in a stew with a man. So actually, whilst that's ooh is quite an easy thing to rhyme with, to make sense repeatedly as your payoff with a different combination each time,
it's very satisfying.
Is amazing anyway. And then to tie them in thematically with the joke you've just parcelled into a couplet.
And I think, and where the music really supports that is that man is always on the beat. So you've got the really satisfying effect of these quadruple inner rhymes, and man is on the beat, so it gives it a derogatory. I don't know. What can you do with a man? It gives it an edge anyway. Yeah. So they've managed to hit both things at once. They're giving us a lovely rhyme scheme whilst remaining derogatory to men everywhere.
Making the joke work, particularly, and within the context of the song as well.
Which is, and what I really love actually about, which is funny we talk about that song particularly, is the way that Rodgers and Hart writes love lyrics. I think is very unique. I mean, Rodgers, of course, famously worked with Hammerstein as well.
Indeed.
And you can look at, and quite a lot of them, it's all lovebirds and doves. Hart really isn't like that.
No.
It's very cold at times, or seemingly cold, but he writes with such realism.
I think it's reserve and bitter. I was talking about this with Mark. There's a strong sense of being bittersweet.
Yes.
That is certainly true in Falling in Love with Love.
That's a very good example. And actually, quite often people get so taken by the melody, but the lyrics are, falling in love with love is falling for make-believe, falling in love with love is playing the fool. It's an anti-love song. It's not a love song, but it is.
But it keeps the hope alive.
Oh, it has to.
Yeah. It is still a love song. Yeah.
Oh, certainly is. And actually, if you lean in too hard for that lyric, there comes a point where if the character's already decided it's hopeless, then why are we singing?
Yeah.
There's nothing to sing about. And really, one thing I've challenged the cast to do is anytime it presents itself as a hopeless song, push hope through it, because it creates a conflict which is in itself interesting to watch. And any song that's too happy, play the loss, you're going to lose it all. Otherwise it's agonising.
And I think Hart, more than anyone else, his lyrics allow you to do that. Particularly in, 1930 shows aren't simple, but, they're very sophisticated, but they can be portrayed as simple or simplistic, particularly since Rodgers and Hammerstein came along and sort of changed the paradigm, for better or for worse. But for me, I love the work of the 1920s. Give me a Gershwin any day.
Oh, yes.
Rodgers and Hart, I think, fabulous. Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, Vincent Youmans, Irving Berlin even, who Irving Berlin is often sort of portrayed as writing very simplistic songs with very simplistic melodies. But the moment you sit down and analyse one of his songs, you realise there's so much more going on. He wrote a song called Lazy. And the very thing about the song Lazy is that it never repeats itself. It's so far from an AABA rhyme scheme, but it actually meanders lazily, but it never repeats itself. So it's not doing anything lazy at all. You just think, oh, Irving Berlin, you're cleverer than you let on.
Oh, yes. And I think what people often do too is they confuse, for fear of sounding a little pompous.
Oh, no, come on in, the water's lovely.
I think it's easy to confuse complexity with difficulty.
That's interesting.
It may be easy to learn. The harmonic information presented may be easy to absorb, but the ideas discussed may be complex.
I think that's absolutely the case. And I think it works, funny enough. I think it's the thing that both Lawrence Hart and Richard Rodgers brings to the table. Now, I'd like to ask your opinion on this. We're already sort of deviating, and I'd love to I do want to talk about the scores, but I want to go back to being a musical director. So this back and forth is fine by me if it's fine by you.
That's fine by me.
And it's lovely, by the way. But I've heard a number of people say that Richard Rodgers is constantly surprising when you play his music. That there are things in there that you don't expect, but it is the thing that you don't expect which makes it so wonderful. And actually, a waltz, he's king of the waltz, we all know that. But actually he can make almost everything do something slightly different. Now, I don't come from the world of music, I come from the world of lyrics, words. That's really where my strengths are. such as they are. But I just wondered how you find Richard Rodgers, just yourself, as a composer, maybe in general, and in this show. And that may be, how do you see Richard Rodgers, in the pantheon, and then actually getting to the nitty-gritty? What has he revealed to you?
Well, that's a very good question. I think he's an excellent melody writer.
Yeah.
Truly. I think his use of range benefits the lyric very, very nicely. In terms of complexity or unpredictability, often you could be stuck in a lovely jump pattern, and you're having a lovely time, and the chord progressions on the page look very predictable, but he's gone about it, or his progressions, how he moves from one key to another, he'll go about it an odd way. Actually, What Can You Do With a Man's a good example. I mean, it's a simple 2-5, very, very simple chords, but then you get moments like, marriage is such a blessing, so I have found, where it seems to deviate completely from the key and finds itself moving back home. So if you weren't reading carefully, you could feel, I'm just repeating these same two chords. Oh, blimey, here we go. So you do have to keep your eyes open. He's fond of using alternative chords for what is a very basic melody. So it's a beautiful melody with some, let's say, more complex, more imaginative harmony underneath.
It's funny you should say, because you mentioned Gilbert and Sullivan earlier. I think of What Can You Do With a Man almost as being a Gilbertian lyric, in the sense it's a little bit of it's not quite a patter song, but it is about, you're expected to listen to the lyrics because it's a funny song. And to a degree, the music therefore acts a little bit more as a support. It's not there quite on the same terms. I think you can think that.
I'd say He and She is a better example of that, actually.
Which is, if you like, the parallel later in
later
Act
on
2, isn't it? Yeah, which is the one about how sometimes disparate couples can make things work, and matched couples may not. But yes,
and that's a very interesting lyric. I mean, at one point the word, I'm going to get this wrong now, prolificacy appeared.
Yeah, she won awards for her prolificacy.
Which,
yes.
I mean, it's delightfully verbose, really. But that's a great example from a musical perspective of very simple chords. It is the same every time. It's very diatonic harmony. There's no sense of diminished. Nothing complex in the harmony. It really is the same chords over and over again. And I think that's really to bring the lyric out.
So that is, if you like, a musical bed for a lyric.
I think so. Very functional, and it works very well.
I mentioned this to Mark in my conversation with him. Are you aware of Richard Rodgers working with Stephen Sondheim on Do I Hear a Waltz in the 1950s, 60s?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, they only had one collaboration together, and it wasn't a massive success in terms of their personalities. I think the score's fabulous, but it's not well regarded, and Stephen Sondheim actually said it was the only show he'd written he wished he hadn't.
Oh, right.
And for the reason was there was no need for the show to exist. Now, that's an essay waiting to be written.
Yes.
Stephen Sondheim says, "Do I hear a waltz? There is no need for this show to exist. Discuss. Show your working." But there's a song in it, which, funnily enough, bearing in mind it's Richard Rodgers, 40 years later, which does exactly the same thing. It's the disparate couples thing again, and it is tour de force lyric by Sondheim with a beautiful but not particularly complicated, or so it seems to be, lyric melody beneath. So Richard Rodgers knows when to present himself and when not. As we're on to Rodgers then, shall we talk a little bit about the fact that in this show there's also music heavy things where the lyrics are much less significant? I'm thinking of, is it the end of Act 1, Let Antipholus In?
Oh yes, that's actually not a scored moment.
Is it not?
There's a stage direction where everyone's meant to sing Let Antipholus In. We actually aren't singing that in our production.
Oh, fine.
It's now a choral chant, not least because we're always having to compromise. We had the great idea of, typically the Boys From Syracuse, the whole story, doesn't it? It's based on comedy of errors. There's two sets of identical twins
with the same names.
With the same names.
Yeah.
But Mark and I, and the team had a fantastic idea that we try and represent that using the same people. So part of the shtick, if you like, of how our production's doing this is, oh my goodness, how on earth are we going to cover 27 parts using only 8 actors? So at that particular moment in the show, I only have 3 actors at my disposal. So the idea of trying to do anything...
You're not going to get a crowd from that, are you?
Not really. But that stage direction intrigued me rather, because you're not wrong. It was a sung moment, but there is nothing in the score written. So goodness knows what they sang. I mean, there are lyrics written down. It is just Let Antipholus In, Let Antipholus In, Let Antipholus In. But there's nothing in the piano vocal.
Now that's really interesting, because it's not in most of the cast recordings, but it's in the 1997 Encores one.
Oh wow!
Which prides itself on going back to the original orchestrations, which they've dug out from somewhere, and I don't quite know where. And it has got a kind of musical bed, but it's. The reason I mention it is because it's clearly a Richard Rodgers musical piece, and you can hear that. occasionally, and I use the word advisedly, punctuated by people shouting, let Antipholus in, and then occasionally building up to a crescendo, but not constantly. It really is a piece of music, let Antipholus in. Music, let Antipholus in. Blah, blah, blah. And you think, well, right, have they been set, are those Antipholus lyrics, as they are, in a set place, or are they improvising against the music?
That's a very good question. I wish I could give you detail. I think what's probably happened here is that the licensed version of the score that we get now wasn't based on the original orchestrations.
No, it's the 1960s version,
London version.
Yeah, exactly.
which
the Bob Monkhouse.
The Bob Monkhouse,
yes,
right.
Yes.
And actually, there were a couple of moments where I stole from other soundtracks and just transcribed.
Homage, I believe, is the word you're searching for so desperately.
I mean, the opening of the show, this is a drama of ancient Greece.
Yes.
I can't remember which soundtrack it is now. I believe it's the original Broadway. There's a lovely little drum scuffle idea, and I just love it so much because it's so silly. And there's a lovely little walking bass line. I just painstakingly slowed it down and just transcribed it because I love it. So
and it also sets up that jazz feeling that you've actually built in anyway.
It does.
That makes perfect sense to me. That feels vampy, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And actually, what I like about what we've done here is we've opened the show with a fanfare. So what's present in the books is an extended overture, which we've cut completely. No overture. Cut completely.
Well, fair enough. It's very modern.
It is. But actually, the part of the reason why I was so happy to make that decision is it means that the very first thing heard is the opening fanfare. Okay. Which is a strong way to start any show.
Jolly well is, yeah, absolutely. And sets a place and a tone as well.
And I sort of fell in love with the contrast of very straightforward fanfare, immediately followed by this jazz scuffle. It sets the audience up for there's a plethora of styles coming at you.
But also a fanfare, oddly to me, in theatre, particularly if you open with it, says Shakespeare, which of course we're never very far away from with the comedy of errors here.
And actually, and the very first line we have is, this is a drama of ancient Greece. It's a very grand way to start. I mean, as an opening lyric, as an opening line, I should say, that's rather high status. It's suggestive of high art. I mean, we are, of course, preparing the audience for something they're absolutely not going to get. Because what follows is a ludicrous farce, which I think is very genuinely hilarious. What was quite funny, actually, is that it doesn't read well on the page. And the number of times I pored over the script, but the initial read-through in the room on day one was eclectic. We were falling about laughing because it really does need to be spoken.
It needs performance, yeah. Because it's a George Abbott book, isn't it?
And a very good one. And I, biased as I am, I think the show is very genuinely hilarious. It's so clever. It's completely ludicrous. And I think they were very careful to stay true to the comedy of errors trope.
But because there's only one line of Shakespeare, I think, in the whole text.
That's
and it's underlined, I believe, by someone who then goes, "Oh, Shakespeare."
Yes, that's right.
But in a way, that's almost perfect, isn't it? You get the best of Shakespeare without being bogged down. But there are Shakespearean references as well in the lyrics, once again, in Verona, my
late brother
cousin Romeo. Yeah, that's right.
Which it's a lovely little sneaky one, which many would miss.
Yeah.
But it speaks of melodrama, of the parallel between the famous Romeo and Juliet catastrophe versus the sham of our marriage. It's the melodrama is wonderful.
It's this is such an odd side journey. Are you aware of the works of René and Renato?
Not really. No.
I really would not worry about it. In British terms, they had a single hit in the late 1970s, and it's a kind of cod romance in that Italianate style. And if you imagine the man who advertises for Go Compare Insurance, you'll get a sense of, there was sort of operetta-ish might be the best way of describing it, even if that's not a word. But apparently the woman who sang on the record didn't want to appear in the video when it became a hit. Oh. So they hired someone very different. And so when it appeared on Top of the Pops, which is how you saw videos in those days, if they weren't singing live, it's very comic. But there is the Renata character is on a balcony. It's Romeo and Juliet.
Oh.
But they're also sort of bumbling, amateur, over-the-top operetta style, in dinner suits as well. So it's that contrast between, exactly as you say, the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet against the, in this case, the bumbling visuals of not quite making it.
And actually, that's present in the show as well. I mean, what's interesting actually is that we've got a cast with a lot of opera experience.
Oh, do you?
Many of our principals are from the opera tradition, and I think they probably came in expecting to be pushed in a very different direction. But there are moments when it really works. And actually, I've been playing a lot with profundity. I've been annoyingly specific about straight tone this, vibrato here. Let's have a thick vibrato span at this point. Because what I'm really doing is using the let's say the weight of the sound to indicate to the audience how seriously to take the lyric. So Dear Old Syracuse is for the most part speech quality, speech level, with a big. I'm allowing him a very thick operatic ending because it's I'm sort of indicating the stakes with the level to which the opera sound is present.
Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a life and death thing going on here, actually, which we forget. It's called The Comedy of Errors in Shakespeare. It's called The Boys from Syracuse, which is immediately a comic-sounding title. Mm-hmm. And yet, within the story, it is about people who are aliens in a city which is not theirs, which is sort of at war, or at least, very much at loggerheads. Ephesus and Syracuse don't like each other, let's put it that way. And if you trespass, you're either executed or you have to be ransomed for a very large amount of money. So there's a life and death thing going on here, and the whole story is based on the tragedy of a family of a husband, wife, identical twins, and their identical twin slave boys being separated in a sea accident, and actually all looking for each other because it's a huge amount of heartbreak and sadness. Our opening character in I Had Twins, he said, I'm glad to die. I've had such, I've lost my wife, I've lost my children, I've lost everything. Your wish to execute me is not all that.
But actually, I think what's hilarious is the juxtaposition of that very serious, very earnest moment set against a very, very happy up-tempo ensemble. I mean, the lyrics they're singing are hurrah, hurroo, there's going to be a killing.
Yes, absolutely.
There's going to be a killing, hurrah, hurroo. And actually, there are two very different stories going on there, where the crowd are just baying for blood.
They are.
At one point, they actually ask, what did he do? He came from Syracuse, and that's enough.
Yeah,
that's enough for them.
What's the use?
Doesn't matter what they did.
Yeah. Also, I quite like that juxtaposition of they're all baying for blood, and then the question, "What did he do?"
Yes.
came up. So actually, we're going to get our execution. He deserves it, and then they find out why. It is quite interesting, and that song, as I say, I'm going to come back to it, but I've really enjoyed the Byzantine conversation we've had so far, and it's been really fascinating. It's also lovely to talk to someone who's got such a handle on it. But we've spoken about the orchestration and how that's working. And by extension, you've been talking about your musical direction. And it sounds to me like you've really got your handle on what the opportunities open to you are and how to capitalise on them and make them work collectively and well. I mean, it's this interesting thing about the operatic style singing and what might be called the swing style swinging, certainly musical theatre style singing.
Yes.
That doesn't always go together. We all remember the amazing Kira Takanoa doing her Gershwin album in the 1980s.
Yes.
And bless, it was a lovely concept, but the operatic style doesn't necessarily work well with the material there. This is of an era not dissimilar. It's 1938. The opera sound may not work, but you're using it dramatically as well as musically, and that's a brilliant combination.
It was one I was nervous of, and actually initially with one of my initial reservations was, what's the ensemble sound going to be? Suddenly it's solo voice ensemble. That is not at all what it was written for. And I really am. It's a much more top-heavy sound. I don't have the luxury of a luxurious string section giving me all the harmony. Suddenly,
that's stuff that makes Richard Rodgers sound like Richard Rodgers.
Exactly. But and actually, I mean, a great moment of you asked me earlier. Well, I'm sort of altering the question slightly. Of what you asked me earlier, was there any moments when you were orchestrating where I wish I'd picked another instrument? O Diogenes, I poured over because it's a all brassy. And I remember sitting there thinking, there's a huge dance break here. What on earth am I going to do? I can't do that. I mean, I wrote a version of the dance break with an alto sax playing the tune and just a trombone plodding away some sort of walking bass. And I thought, this is awful. And in the end, I thought, I'm going to make it a piano solo. So what I've actually done is I've gone for a very swing jazz feel with the alto and the trombone answering. I've done something completely different with it because I thought, the more I tried to make that work, the more it didn't.
The more it got away from you.
The more it got away from me. So I thought, well, I'll keep the up tempo feel. I've suddenly shoved the tune in octaves and chords on the piano, and gone very, very jazzy about it. And there are moments I found myself writing on the drum part, "Rock it out," because if we're going into heavy jazz, we're going into heavy jazz.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy with how it's turned out. It did feel sacrilegious at the time. I thought that's not at all what Rodgers heard, but I've got to do something. And he did want jazz, by all accounts.
And also, you can't. It must serve. It's got to serve. And as you were talking at the very beginning about you shouldn't do a reduction because all you're doing is watering down something else. If you can't stay true to the original as written in this dance break for O Diogenes, then actually you've got to strike out.
Yes.
And then you've got to find your own way. And it sounds to me like you've succeeded very well there. Obviously by giving a piano jazz heart, if you like, to it, that's you on the piano. Do you... is the jazz orchestrated, or are you actually extemporising every night?
A bit of both. It's one of these. I have written a part. I will not play what's written. It's one of those.
Yeah.
I mean,
keeps
really,
you fresh though, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. It does. I mean, I might change an inversion. So the reason I wrote it out is for texture. I knew I wanted thick moving chords in octaves. In terms of what those chords precisely are, what inversion those chords are in, that could alter. And actually, it probably won't be till the band call when I hear the whole thing together, when I finally make a decision. But the band call day will be a very big day for me because, I've recorded mock-up tracks on the page. It's all harmonically correct.
But will it?
I'm fully prepared.
Yes.
I just happened to be on other projects where I finally hear something, and I think it doesn't work. Just doesn't work. It clashes, or I can't achieve harmony. Not in the sense of two notes working together. I can't achieve the inner conversations that I wanted. And what I've also done is the players themselves have flagged these charts are hard. I mean, I'm really killing them all because I've got, including myself, one challenge that I'm already not looking forward to is that the show was very obviously designed to be stick conducted. With a show of this period, you have the luxury of a large orchestra. The musical director will stand there with a baton and lead, because you can really follow the singer. You can take time. I have my hands down for most of the show.
And eyes as well.
And eyes down.
Yes, exactly.
So suddenly, most of the cueing will be done with my head. So what I've done in the rehearsing of the show is give the singers no space. I'm waiting for nobody. Not that I'm going to perform it that way, but they get the sense that there has to be some through line. And there'll be moments where I can... Where initially there was a pause and a series of dictated cues, I might represent that with a gradual slow down that can be controlled. So there are certain times where I've had to adjust tempo situations based on the limitations of having my hands down the entire time. We've also gone with the idea of not using monitors. Typically, for any what we call piano conduct show, where the musical director has to both play and lead the orchestra and cast, you would have a monitor, which means a camera on the musical director and two television screens.
So people could just look up and get their cue from that, as it were.
Quite so.
Or take their lead anyway, yes.
We've decided not to do that at all.
Ooh.
Partly because it's distracting in the space. We're staging the whole thing in Thos. There's audience on three sides.
Oh, right, okay.
So if you've got television screens on three
people
walls...
will see them,
people
of course.
See them.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
distraction.
And we live in a world where televisions are everywhere now, including in building societies and goodness knows where. And you look at them.
You do.
The eye is drawn to a screen now.
The eyes drawn to any electronic light. And I thought, so that's presented a unique challenge as well, because it's a lovely comfort blanket for a musical director. But what that means is I've had to write the scores such that they get oral cues, not visual. So where before I can take all the time I need, I'm allowed to be that centerpiece of keeping everything together.
Yeah.
I now can't be that. So it might be the case that where previously I'd be able to say to a singer, eyes on me at this point, I'm just going to show you a clear downbeat. It'll be listen for the drum fill and follow that, or on beat one the trombone comes in with a note, coming on beat two based on that cue. So
jump in on the sound.
So it's lock in with your ears, not your eyes, because there are certain moments where I will not be able to show them anything. So I've been. That's also partly why by using the tracks in the rehearsal has been quite good, because the track won't wait.
No.
The track won't follow.
And it's on, you sing.
Quite that. And if you miss, there've been a couple of hilarious moments in the rehearsal process where I've played on thing I am waiting for no one.
Oh yeah.
You may press on. I'm not waiting. But actually, what's interesting is where they don't get the chance to indulge musically in that way, suddenly the focus becomes on the lyric.
Now that's really interesting.
I think one thing I've been quite keen on discovering is, let's not get so caught up in the way we're telling the message that the message itself gets lost.
And that can be done. We've all seen it.
Oh, certainly it can. Yeah. I sometimes joke that if someone were watching the show who didn't speak English, would they have a sense in the way it's being performed what's going on? I mean, because in opera, you fully expect to go to E&O, watch a show in an entire language you don't speak, and expect to follow the plot.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is the way in which the lyrics being articulated. But if the whole if we're just following musical cues and treating, I mean, I sometimes tease the singers for, we're not cellos. Don't get so caught up in the melody that we lose the reason why the melody was written. It's what we're saying beyond how we're saying it.
And it is interesting, isn't it? Because the audience will be listening out for the lyric, because that's still our natural way of connecting with what's going on. Words do still trump music. I don't mean that rudely, but,
absolutely.
But in terms of narrative, and drama is still narrative, and musicals are nothing more than drama, that's absolutely the case.
I mean, the music in some ways underscores the lyric. But I mean, one thing I've said I haven't said it on this production actually, but if you were to take all the music away, and all the lyrics were to be delivered as text, the show makes sense.
You could do that, yeah.
Take the text away and leave the music, it means nothing. So really, any musical decision on voice quality or on dynamic, on pause, what possible criteria am I using to make those decisions other than the lyric itself?
But once again, what serves the narrative? Yeah,
but
that's refreshing to hear, by the way.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, my job certainly is to serve the score, both as an orchestrator and as a conductor. But I think it's been really exciting working with. I don't like reduced orchestration with a smaller band and with a smaller cast, because it really does add clarity. And suddenly the storytelling can be so much more vibrant. It may not have a grandness to the scale, but actually the intimacy of performance.
That's the word, isn't it?
Really adds to it. Yeah. And I've been so annoying about diction, so annoying about cut-offs. The cast are ready to kill me at this stage, because I want the lyrics. And actually there are moments where I'll say, that is a plot point. We will not get that in the text at any other point. It is crucially important that comes across strongly.
And isn't that interesting as well? Because there's this, I mean, it's not true, but there's this idea that when Rodgers and Hammerstein got together and did Oklahoma, that is when the song started being a way of driving the narrative forward. But it's not true, because it's in this. Exactly as you've identified, there are things which take place in the songs which they're not just repetition of what's been said or is about to be said. They carry that plot forward.
And actually, Rodgers and Hammerstein are often credited as, let's say, founding the integrated musical. They say.
Yes.
Where, I mean, it used to be. I mean, if we go
I'm
back,
a naysayer, by the way, in this particular church.
No, I agree. I agree.
Oh, yes.
Well, I think really,
I knew you were a man of distinction and wisdom. Yes.
Well, I think it's a bit naive, really, to credit any one person with that.
Of course, it is.
Yeah. I mean, but I think you could criticise earlier theatre by saying that the songs really have a function.
Yeah.
So the show opens. There's always an "I Want" song where the lead. I mean, take "The Hills Are Alive with the Sound of Music." It's a great example. She'll come out. She'll sing an "I Want" song, and it introduces her character arc. But for the most part, especially with love songs, actually, you could, for the most part, remove a love song from one show and swap it with another. But you really can't do that with Rodgers and Hart at all.
No, I agree with that.
Because the context is so heavy. And actually, what sometimes gets given a lot of credit for, it's not dialogue. Oh, something's happened. Let's now sing about it. Yeah. It's dialogue. Oh, the music started, but there is no point in which the scene stops and the reflection begins. Suddenly, it's happening through the song. And I've had many say that sometimes responsible for that, but it goes way back. And that certainly happens with Rodgers and Hart. In some ways, then the question becomes, why musicalise it at all? Partly it's because we can manipulate the way in which the message is received. Yeah. If it's delivered as a line, then surely it forces the actor to use intonation, inflection to make the point. But I think Hurrah Hurrah, the opening number, is a great example, because those lyrics read horribly.
Yeah,
there's going to be a killing. Hurrah, it's horrible. But when it's under this ridiculously up-tempo, very, very cheerful, and Jared, our choreographer, has done a wonderful job at putting together the most ludicrous, silly nonsense behind the choreography possible. But initially, it's the first number I taught, and we were getting very operatic and getting very busy about the chords, part of the problem is we're treating this far too seriously. Yeah. It is a piece of frothy nonsense. It was a piece of frothy nonsense in 1938. And it's a piece of frothy nonsense today. And it's funny, I do a lot of teaching work in drama schools. I wanted somebody come to me and say, I want to look at some very serious, legit, as we say, classical sound, legit musical theatre. I want to do some very serious, heavy-duty song work. So I've brought some Gilbert and Sullivan. Yeah. Comic opera. They wrote comic opera. The whole point of Gilbert and Sullivan is they're trying not to be Wagner.
Yeah, absolutely.
If they heard you say, it's this serious repertoire, absolutely not.
But I agree with you entirely, and I'm a great GNS fan. But it's interesting that they are now moving into the opera houses.
Yes.
You know, if you want to see professional GNS in London, you can either see it at the Wiltons, where it's still sort of true to its original roots, or you can see it at the ENO. And they still don't quite know what to do with it.
No,
their HMS Pinafore was a mixed bag.
I didn't see it myself, but I did. Many of my friends did, and the comment I kept hearing back was, "It's just all too serious. They're taking it far too seriously. Far too seriously."
They also added a lot of material which was not up to snuff, but there we are. A conversation for another day, if I may say.
But it's funny. I remember saying to. We've got an eclectic mix of backgrounds within our singers. Some, as I say, come from a strong operatic background. Others are what we call "quote unquote" MT.
Yeah.
And actually blending.
But not
them.
MT vessels. Yes.
Okay, MT are not empty vessels. But I've always hated the word legit.
Yeah.
I mean,
because it suggests other things are not.
Quite.
Yeah, it's the problem, isn't it?
I mean, I'm not even sure where the term came from. I mean, for the sake of those who may not know, legit is the word we use for that style of musical theatre singing brought on by classical tradition, such as you might find in a lot of older shows. They're not exclusively, where contemporary, quite separate from modern, then comes to mean that style of musical theatre singing brought on by pop rock tradition. And it's one that people often confuse legit as an era. I mean, that period of golden age and legit are not synonymous. I mean, quite often people come in and sing "I'm Just a Girl That Can't Say No" from Oklahoma as they're legit, which it plainly isn't. It's oral twang. But this show, I've really played around with the operatic elements, and there are some moments which we've really lent into contemporary. Karen, for instance, at the end of What Could You With a Man, is full on belting the ending because she's having a meltdown.
Yeah, it is a traumatic experience for her, which just happens to be coming out in a comic song.
It was a very organic thing where she was getting very hyped up, getting very emotionally involved in the text, opened her lungs, belted the ending, and I remember she looked at me and went, "Sorry, that was probably way too far and wrong for the style." I thought, I buy it.
No, I mean, yeah.
I buy it. And it's also worth noting that the way in which this material was performed when the show first came out and the way that older material is performed today is different.
It is, absolutely.
We don't sing legit the same way now. And I think part of that is to do with technology, actually. I mean, it used to be that the celebrated voices were the ones that could carry to the end of the concert hall, which is fine when you're singing over acoustic instruments. But these days, you're not working with a string section, you're working with electronic keyboards.
Indeed.
And with the imposition, which is for better or worse, but with the imposition of electronic sound, we then have microphones. So now we're trying to make it, which we are using. Yes. We're using microphones as well. Mainly for displacement of sound. It's a very small venue. Their voices will carry, and the only electronic influence we're having in the orchestra, we're not miking the players at all. Yeah. We've got the mallet station, the percussion,
you mentioned,
going through an amp, and I'll be playing an electronic keyboard. But that's not because I want to make it louder in any way. It's so I can displace sound around the space.
It's to control it, isn't it, in that sense, actually, which is ironically quite the difference. It's not just to fill a space, it's to use the space appropriately. But
given that we've now got, suddenly, volume and power, it's not about that anymore, because if I want it louder, I'll turn the mic up.
Yes.
and actually, it comes to don't project the text, don't make more noise. It's something I've said a lot of. Our cast is certainly capable of a powerhouse vocal, and I've laughed occasionally and said, "That sounds lovely. I didn't understand a word."
You know, fun enough. It's not quite the same thing, but I caught a version of Dido and Aeneas by Purcell at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year. Wonderful sound, but it was impossible to detect, I'm sorry to say, what the soprano was singing.
Yes. What was the point?
Yeah, so it became a musical bed, which it felt like a duvet. I sort of allowed it to sort of wash over me. Not that duvets do that, but you get the idea. And I was with some friends, and none of us could work out what was going on. You hear all the vowels, but you don't hear the consonants. Although, just briefly, talking about Gilbert and Sullivan and how they are so much of a pastiche, or at least gently tickling more classical traditions. There's so much in Dido and Aeneas which is later on used in Gilbert and Sullivan.
Wow.
There was a peer from The Sorcerer was in there, more or less. So anyway, there we are. That's by the by.
I think it's always curious. You notice these things, and part of you're always tempted to overanalyze. And I wonder, wouldn't it be lovely to know whether they did that on purpose? To be honest, Hart's lyric is often so direct and so deliberate. I'm normally inclined to believe that any time is that a reference? Probably.
Oh, I think there's a lot more going on. I read the other day, and I can't find the source, so I can't vouch for it absolutely. There was something going on in 1938, and I think it was... Now, my memory might be completely wrong, so if this is nonsense, please, I apologise now. But there was a state... or an area called Allbarn or something like that, where I believe the brothels were being closed for public decency. And of course there's a line in I Want to Go Back to Syracuse, which is about take the night boat to Albania.
Yes.
And the person was asserting that the audience would have understood that the Alban or the Allbarn in Albania was in fact not the country Albania, but was actually a reference to the brothel houses closing.
And actually, I'm quite willing to believe that. There are no other references to Albania in the show.
No, it's random, isn't it?
It is very random.
Yeah, it's quite.
It is very random. And actually, the theme of prostitution is strong in the show anyway.
In that song, there's a lovely red light reference, isn't there?
Oh, they're everywhere. And actually, one of my favourite songs in the whole piece, which strangely we've actually used as the opening of Act 2. It's the first thing we'll hear. Is Ladies of the Evening.
In the morning.
And it's absolutely hilarious because you're presented with a glory... And we're presenting it very grandly. It was written in unison. I have a big choral sound in 8-part harmony. But the lyrics are... one of my favourite lyrics in the whole show. The policeman's lot is the ladies of the evening in the morning.
Some references there, aren't there?
Oh, it's hilarious. My policeman's lot, of course, not a happy one. But it's... we see the ladies of the evening... when they're having the walk of shame back home. We don't see them in their evening glamour. And it's the whole song, if you on the surface, it's a lovely little song about ladies in the evening. It absolutely isn't. No. It's these poor women of the night in their worst possible form in the morning.
With the lights on.
It's hilarious. With the lights on.
Yeah.
And what a hilarious concept for a song anyway.
And I think there's another thing going on in that song. And once again, I absolutely believe this is Lawrence Hart. No doubt that there is the meta thing going on, to use a modern phrase, that this is about, Plato's mentioned in a song.
Yes. It's in...
Wear My Nicest Negligee.
And
find him
reading Plato.
It's in What Can You Do With a Man again.
Course, yeah.
It's very much our lodestone song for this.
It's a wonderful song.
But Plato is all about the Platonic ideal and how reality never quite matches it. The Ladies of the Evening,
but very, very appropriate for that song, which is ultimately about a failed relationship.
Indeed, and also for Ladies of the Evening, you've got the glamour, the ideal of their professional evenings compared to the hair down morning, and it's all about sort of degradation at one level. A joke becomes a pun, so it's all these things which in the morning are much less potent, should we say.
A plum becomes a prune as well. It's so rude.
But also you get the but it's meta in the sense that actually the Boys from Syracuse is a degradation of the Comedy of Errors, which in itself is a degradation of the original Plautus.
Yes.
It's what we used to call a next generation video, if you like. I think that's what's going on in that song as well.
Highly possible.
But it's knowing, isn't it? I think so.
I remember. I initially started orchestrating that one way, then I properly read the lyrics. I never made the mistake in any other song and thought, well, that's completely wrong. And I started again.
I'm so pleased to hear that, though. That acknowledgement that there's more.
Oh yes, yeah. But it was. I started with it because it's short. I thought it was a way in. I was quite distracted, and I thought, well, plainly the lyric is. Any possible orchestration decision has to be based on the lyric. Otherwise, what possible grounds are we doing it for? We are singing words. We are not a string quartet.
Do you know? Sorry, I'm sorry to do this tangent thing, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on this because you're in the business. But Act 2 of Kiss Me Kate at the Barbican opens with Too Darn Hot, and it's been staged and choreographed as though it is actually about everyone getting terribly randy and sexy. It's done as a very sexy opener to Act 2.
It's too much.
But that's not what the lyrics are about. The lyrics are exactly about the opposite.
Yes.
It's too hot, and actually it's not about Mr. Lovey-Dovey is not interested. So it doesn't work with its lyrics. It's misunderstood what it's about, and also it doesn't understand where it is in its own narrative either, because it's just happened after they all come off stage because they've had guns held at them by the gangsters, and they're all really angry and upset, and then they go into slinky sexy, and you just think...
I think really the conversation that needs to be had there was we needed a disparity between the orchestration and the movement.
Yeah.
Because what's presented in the
That's the fun,
orchestration
isn't it?
is a very, very sexy, but you can't replicate that with the movement.
No.
Because actually there's a really clear opportunity there to physically represent that what we're hearing is not the truth. It reminds me of the opening of Wicked, where the lyric is, good news, she's dead, the witch of the west is dead. And what you're hearing is very, very clashing harmonies.
She came from Syracuse.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, sorry.
But you hear that and think straight away, they're lying. I know nothing about it, but it's a classic example of how
you can draw it out from what's happening.
Oh, certainly,
Yeah.
because the band are playing in one key whilst the singers are singing in another. But if you take the band away, they're just singing a very, very bright major, good news, she's dead, the witch of the west is dead in E major. But the orchestra put a C natural in the bass. The clash is horrendous. And straight away, without knowing any of the characters' names or what anyone's talking about, you know that what they're saying is a lie.
It's a discombobulation.
It is.
That's the joy of theatre. And you were talking about earlier on, why has this show been a musical? Why is it a musical? Why is any show a musical? It's actually because these things can be done so much more effectively or excitingly or subtly or
clearly,
enigmatically with music, and sometimes working with, sometimes working against. I love all this.
We've done something quite odd with the Act 1 ballet. The Amazons ballet, the Courtesans Entertainment.
Yeah.
We had some problem with this. Of course, what was written was a hugely extended ballet. We have one dancer at our disposal.
Oh, right, yes.
And so we thought, what on earth are we going to do? I won't spoil
No,
what
I'm
we've done
looking
for
forward
staging.
to it.
But without giving anything away, because there's a big visual gag, which I won't say, but there's we needed to use a theme from the show for Fatima's dance. And in the end, I chose to jazz up This Can't Be Love. The point being that what you're seeing, I mean, the last time we heard those words, it's This Can't Be Love, because I
feel so well.
I feel so well. And so what I was trying to indicate there was, this is a facade. It's a sexual dance you're seeing, but hopefully they can draw the link to, it's something, all's not well.
Exact. Once again, Shakespeare very nearly, by the way. All's well that isn't not well.
All's well that...
Yeah. But once again, that disconnect, or through what you're seeing and what you're hearing and what you're experiencing, and actually something inside of one going.
And what's funny is that people... I remember one of the cast members asked me, do you really think that they're going to pick that up? I think they can.
Yes.
I think they can. Sometimes without even knowing it, I think. But if they don't, then the physical movement speaks for itself.
Yeah.
But I think it's definitely worth investing in that detail.
I never underestimate your audience. Even if only one person gets it, someone's got it. If that's the intent. But actually, I think audiences are much more sophisticated. And actually, when you're in an intimate environment, it's easy to pick up the cues as well. And we've said how intimate this is. Musical talk. And that brings the end of the first part of that wonderful conversation with Benjamin Levy to an end. He's a musical director, an educator, an orchestrator, and a great deal more. And in 2022, he won an award, the Off West End Award for Best Musical Director. And as you heard in that conversation, he really knows what he's talking about, and he takes things seriously and is very clearly a man of theatre. He doesn't look at the world through a prism of musical direction. He looks at it much more widely in terms of what is the theatrical outcome that needs to be presented. And he's also a fabulous conversationalist, as you heard. Do join me next week for the second part of that conversation with Benjamin, when we concentrate a lot more on the fabulous, sparkling score from the Boys from Syracuse. And remember, if you want to see the show, you can. It's on in London at Upstairs at the Gatehouse, which is in Highgate Village. The postcode is London North 6 4BD, and the nearest tube station is Highgate, which is on the Northern Line. It's on between Thursday the 5th until Sunday the 29th of September. Evening performances are 7:30 in the evening, and that's Tuesdays to Saturdays. There's a performance at 4 o'clock on Sunday in the afternoon, and there are Saturday matinees on the 21st and 28th at 3 p.m. And the best way of booking tickets and finding out more about this production is go to the website www.upstairsatthegatehouse.com. And if you want to find out a bit more about Benjamin Levy, you can. His website is www.benjamin-levy.com. So do think about going to see the show, and do think about going to find out more about Benjamin and his work. And I do hope that you'll return for next week's episode of Musical Talk, where we do something I adore doing, looking at the nature and structure of songs in a forensic way to find out how they work and why they're successful when they are. And in the score of the Boys from Syracuse, they always are, not a single failure. To quote Benjamin, Lawrence Hart is an utter genius. And as you heard, he was also no less complimentary towards Richard Rodgers. Next week, we're going to be looking at the songs they wrote together for this wonderful show, and I know you'll enjoy it. However, I think it's time to bring this episode to an end. I do hope you'll be able to join me next week, or whenever, here on Musical Talk. And it seems fitting to me to quote Richard Rodgers' other long-term lyricist partner, Oscar Hammerstein, by saying, "So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen. Goodbye." This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2024. And my thanks go to Benjamin Levy for his time and generosity, and also to Emma Wall for making this conversation possible. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on the usual social media networks like Facebook, Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to follow me on the latter, you can. At Musical Talk Thos.
The piano is the cha to the bass is that was the... Oh, no, what am I thinking of? Oh, that'd be great. Cut this out.
I will cut it out.
Imagine if we open with that.